All right, hello and welcome everybody. Today I've got something for you about the benefits of lower stakes in stories. Now, it seems really common to me in fiction that I've been reading recently where a lot of stories, a lot of books are about, oh, this is a thing that is, the end of the world, the end of the end of the universe kind of thing. It seems like it's very common as a kind of easy way to drive rising action to raise the stakes in a story to the point where they're often unrealistically kind of elevated to the point where like it's like how did they get by before these heroes appeared if this kind of thing is happening every year, kind of, like if there's a line of giant meteors all facing straight at the earth and one's going to hit every single year, well, how did we get away with surviving when the heroes weren't here? It's worth noting that many of my favorite stories are actually fairly low stakes. Like, I love the Rex Stout Near Wolf series, right? And each of those, like, those are murder mysteries, and they're not even about about saving a person's life in a lot of cases, but about whether, like, because a lot of the perpetrators in these books are not like likely to go on another killing spree, right? And so the story is more about whether the perpetrator is going to even be brought to justice, which is even lower stakes than like a person's life, because the person who gets murdered in these murder mysteries is generally part of the plot, and that's that's a fait accompli, right? And so, like, there are lots of great stories that have relatively low stakes. In fact, a lot of really old, not old, but like classic literature has, are human interest stories about, people living through the Great Depression, or, I'm thinking of like, John Steinbeck or something like that, right? These aren't stories of like people saving the world or even saving a city or even saving, you know, a person, but are about like day-to-day goings on of people and how they're interacting with each other, and you can get a lot of really good gripping stories out of that, um, without having some kind of massive ticking clock or end of the world counter happening in the background. And I feel like in a lot of media that I consume these days, there's a excessive focus on stuff having these really high stakes. So what are some more of the advantages of having lower stakes in a story that you're writing, or even a story that you're reading or consuming, watching on TV or whatever? Lower stakes allows the characters to disagree more easily, and that can be interesting. That kind of interpersonal conflict can be a very interesting driver of a story, as opposed to cases where, like, well, we're saving the world and there's a bad guy and he wants to kill everybody and he has his dudes, but no reasonable person is going to stand in our way from our efforts to save the world from the bad guys, right? The end of the world irons out most petty arguments is kind of where I'm going with that. It allows you to focus on the differences between the characters as opposed to having them all have not exactly, but like a very similar goal. They can all have different goals, and they can have minor clashes based on small differences in their goals. One person might want to reach a certain point, and another person might want to reach that point also, but might not be willing to reach it in the same manner as the first character. Things like that. It allows you to have more grounded, less powerful characters. And powerful characters are a bit of a danger sometimes because as you write about them more and more, you end up kind of writing yourself into a corner of, well, he did this time, why doesn't he just do this time? It becomes hard to continue to write, or it becomes hard to continue. It doesn't become hard to write the scenarios, but it becomes harder to make them like realistic or not realistic, like believable. Yeah, it allows you to have your characters be more like real people, more relatable, which isn't the same thing as being realistic, if that makes sense. I'm kind of thinking about this as like kind of a paradox of escapism, if that makes sense, where you want the characters to be relatable, but not necessarily realistic, right? Nobody really relates, well, I won't say nobody, but it's hard to relate to a character like Superman. But like a character like Frodo Baggins is much more easy to relate to, even though both of them are unrealistic characters, right? They're not regular people living in a regular world. They're people, with, Superman has extraordinary capabilities and extraordinary, ethical integrity, right? But he has, the powers to do things that allow him to solve problems by himself in ways that other people cannot. On the other side of the spectrum, you have Frodo Baggins, who is, almost against his will, thrown into this, relatively high stakes situation, but because he's relatively weak by comparison to, like a superhero character, he's a lot more relatable. You can kind of feel what he's feeling as you read the story. And, in the same way, you've got, Archie Goodwin in the Nero Wolfe stories. You can relate to Archie as he tries to help Wolfe solve this murder mystery case, as opposed to, if Archie Goodwin had just had a magic lens that told him, you're the murderer, right? Or, if he had some kind of superpower that made him invulnerable from, being hurt by a murderer or something like that. There are lots of times where the character is in danger, and that helps make things more relatable while not necessarily being an issue with stakes, whether or not. But those are kind of independent things, but they touch on each other. Another thing is that when you're constantly writing these high stakes situations, it can kind of create a fatigue in me for reading. Like, okay, we saved the world, we saved the solar system, we saved the galaxy, we saved the universe, we saved the multiverse, we saved the, the infinityverse, I don't know. And that kind of constant ratcheting up of things it makes it so that eventually, like, yeah, okay, obviously they're going to win. The stakes are so high that if they lose, it's just the end of the universe. Do we actually believe that they're going to fail? They might, but that's not a very interesting ending for the story, right? And just the end, and then he was shot. The end, right? And so you can get this kind of fatigue where they're like, yeah, another meteor, great, and that makes it also harder for like smaller things to affect the reader, right? And when I say reader, I mean like consumer of media, because this is a thing in like movies too, right? Like we have this constant ratcheting up in stakes in like the modern Star Wars trilogy. We have like, we had the Death Star, now we have the the Death Moon, Death Planet, right? We had Star Destroyers, now we have 1,000 Star Destroyers that all have Death Star technology on them to blow up planets. And everything's constantly getting bigger and bigger to the point where it's like, I don't know. I guess it just sits poorly with me. I don't know about you, but I guess this seems like something that could be a pretty reasonable thing for people to think, is that like, wow, I did so much. I've seen this thing get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's just kind of unbelievable at that point. Another thing that having lower stakes helps to do is to avoid, I'm going to call it something funky, like one-of-a-kinding your heroes, right? Like, yes, your characters are, unique and interesting and powerful, and they save the world. But the question is, what, if these kinds of, and if you draw, and you can do that in one book, but if you do the same thing in the second book, and the same thing in the third book, and the same thing in the fourth book, eventually the reader's going to start looking at like, well, wait a minute. This world that they're in is coming under, potentially existential threats every 2 years, right? What the heck did they do? Like, there's no reason for these existential threats to coincide with the existences of these heroes. So what did the world do before the heroes existed, and what did the world do after the heroes existed? Or what will the world do after the heroes cease to exist, right? What will they do when they're gone? Is this one of those things where we have like this, where like, the thing about conflict is that you don't want to have these large perfect streaks, right? Like, it's more interesting in many cases to look at the boxer who has one loss as opposed to the boxer who has no losses, right? Or like the sports team that is the underdog coming back up to have a surprise win. Like, these are all kind of tropey examples, but they involve someone who has failed before, picking things up and making it so they don't fail this time. And in a world where these kinds of universal apocalypses happen every 2 years, you also have to have like a perfect streak of victories, which again makes things a little bit harder to like surprise the reader. It's like, yep, they won, and they won again, and they won again, and they won again, and they won again, and they won again. And one of the good things that you can do to help make characters more interesting is to have them fail. And if all of your stakes are so high that that failure means the end of the universe, then you can only have them fail in very minor things, and that can be a little bit unsatisfying for readers, I guess. The other thing that writing low-stakes stories can do is to lend more gravity to situations where the stakes are suddenly raised. For example, in the Rex Stout novels, in the Nero Wolfe novels, most of them are just like, here's a person who got murdered, and maybe a second person who got murdered as a result of the murderer trying to keep themselves away from justice. But it kind of terminates there, right? Wolfe figures out who the killer is, and blah 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 blah, the end. And so, because most of the stories are kind of chill like that, relatively low stakes, it actually is kind of fun when the stakes suddenly get raised, like when you have the Arnold Zek books, right, where suddenly Wolfe meets or comes in contact with a criminal mastermind, and it's not that this criminal mastermind is causing the murders, but there are murders that are related to what this mastermind is doing, and Wolfe has to toe the line or walk the tightrope between solving the murder and trying to avoid catching too much heat from this mastermind, up to the point where he eventually has to take on the mastermind himself. That's a fun raising of stakes. It's like, this is an issue. The mastermind is more angry now because this is the second issue. This is the third issue. Now things have come down to an actual confrontation. And because the stakes are usually so low, it makes a lot more fun and exciting when the stakes are suddenly raised, and you see that success, and then the stakes come back down to where they normally are. There's also one other little point I'd like to make before I finish today, and that is a purely commercial point for anyone who happens to be writing or creating media of any sense. And that is that independent publishing, like on Amazon or wherever, honestly, seems to be really enamored with series. There are lots of people who are writing that this book is book one of the book of the blah series, and that seems to be pretty eerily ubiquitous on Amazon. Almost every book is book, even places where there hasn't been a second book produced yet. Everything is book one of one in the blah series, which means that if you want a better chance at commercial success in independent publishing, that you need to, not need to, but that it's easier to be successful if you write things as a series. And that means that if you are writing something in a series, that you can't simply increase the stakes every single time. Otherwise, you'll end up with, this is the end of the universe, very, very soon. And that's annoying, but there we go. Yeah, those are my thoughts on the benefits of lower stakes in stories. My goal is to encourage people here to, number one, if they happen to be creating stories in any sense, to consider lowering the stakes of certain things to make things more grounded, make it more about the characters interacting with each other and having their own little differences. And number two, I'd like people who consume media, that would be probably the majority of people watching this, but I'd like people who watch movies, watch TV shows, read books, to look at stories and think about how high the stakes are and how the author, filmmaker or whatever, created the stakes and how they set them at the level that they are, and whether that works well or whether it works poorly, depending on what you're looking at, for instance. But I think there's a lot to be learned by understanding the stakes of a story and using that to kind of better understand how plot-driven versus character-driven a story might be, things like that. So yeah, that's something to just pay attention to. So I thought it was kind of interesting to talk about. But yeah, that's all I've got for today. A little bit of a shorter video today, but lower stakes. All right. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you like what I'm doing here and you want to help support the channel, you know what to do. If you really like what I'm doing, go check out my fiction and see if any of that is up your alley. Maybe yes, maybe no. Who knows? Anyway, have a good day, and I will see you tomorrow for... Ooh, do I have an idea for tomorrow? I don't have an idea for tomorrow on hand. I'll have to think of something. Anyway, see you later.